Yes, one pities him, and nevertheless, while he could have given her a good thrashing with a strap, sent her to the devil, or even portrayed her with all her sins, wails, wanderings, and innumerable betrayals in one of those novels with which he occupied his prison leisure. But no, the prologue, and partly in What to Do, we are touched by his attempts to rehabilitate his wife. There are no lovers around, only reverential admirers. Nor is there that cheap coquetry which led men, whom she called Mushinki, an awful diminutive, to think her even more accessible than she really was, and all one finds is the vitality of a witty, beautiful woman. Dissipation becomes emancipation, and respect for her battling husband. Some respect she did feel for him, but to no purpose, is made to dominate all our other feelings. In the prologue, the student Mironov, in order to mystify a friend, tells him that Volgin's wife is a widow. This so upsets Madame Volgin that she bursts into tears, and likewise the heroine in What to Do, representing the same woman, pines among giddy cliches for her arrested husband, where he carefully scans through a pair of binoculars on one side of the auditorium, then the other, whereupon tears of tenderness gush from under the lenses. He came to verify that his wife, sitting in her box, was more attractive and more elegant than anyone else, in exactly the same way as Chernyshevsky himself in his youth had compared Nadezhda Loborovsky with women's heads. And here we find ourselves again surrounded by the voices of his aesthetics, for the motifs of Chernyshevsky's life are now obedient to me. I have tamed its themes. They have become accustomed to my pen. With a smile I let them go in the course of development. They merely describe a circle like a boomerang or a falcon, in order to end by returning to my hand, and even if any should fly far away beyond the horizon of my page, I am not perturbed. It will fly back just as this one has done. And so on May 10, 1855, Chernyshevsky was defending at the University of St. Petersburg the dissertation which we are already familiar, the relations of art to reality, written in these August nights, 1853, i.e. precisely at that time when the vague lyrical emotions of his youth that had suggested to him considering art in terms of a pretty girl's portrait had finally ripened and now produced this pulpy fruit in natural correlation with the hypothesis of his marital passion, Stranyulubsky. It was at this public debate that the intellectual trend of the 60s was first proclaimed, as old Shelgunov later recalled, noting with discouraging naivete that the president of the university, Pletnyov, was not moved by the speech of the young scholar, whose genius he failed to perceive. The audience, on the other hand, was in ecstasy. So many people had piled in that same had to stand in the windows. They descended like flies on carrion, snorted Turgenev, who must have felt wounded in his capacity, or professed aesthete, as though, although he himself was not averse to pleasing the flies. As often happens with unsound ideas which have not freed themselves of the flesh or have been overgrown by it, one can detect in the young scholar's aesthetic notions his own physical style, the very sound of his shrill didactic voice. Beauty is life. That which pleases us is beautiful. Life pleases us in its good manifestations. Speak of life and only life. Thus continues the sound, so willingly accepted by the acoustics of the century, and if humans do not live humanely, why teach them to live, portray them, the lives of exemplary men and well-organized societies? Art is just a substitute or verdict, but in no wise the equal of life, just as an etching is artistically far inferior to the picture from which it has been taken a particularly charming thought. The only thing, however, pronounced the discourser clearly, in which poetry can stand higher than reality, is the embellishment of events by a addition of accessory effects, and by making the character of the personages described correspond with the events in which they take part. Thus, in denouncing pure art, the men of the 60s, and good Russian people after them right up to the 90s, were denouncing, in result of misinformation, their own false conception of it. Or just as 20 years later, the social writer Garshin saw pure art in the paintings of Semiradsky, a rank academician, or as an ascetic may dream of a feast that would make an Epicurean sick, so Chernyshevsky, having not the slightest notion of the true nature of art, saw its crown, its conventional, slick art, i.e. anti-art, which he combated, lunging at nothing, At the same time, one must not forget the other camp, the camp of the aesthetes. The critic Durshinin, with his pedantry and tasteless iambicy, or Turgenev with his much too elegant visions and misuse of Italy, often provided the enemy with exactly that cloying stuff which it was so easy to condemn. Nikolai Gavrilovich castigated pure poetry whenever he found it, in the most unexpected byways. Criticizing a reference book in the pages of the Contemporary, 1854, he quoted a list of entries which in his opinion were too long. Labyrinth, Laurel, Linclos, Nenon, and a list of entries which were too short. Laboratory, Lafayette, Lenin, Lessing. An eloquent cavil, a motto that fits the whole of his intellectual life. The oleographic billows of poetry gave birth, as we have seen, to full-blossomed luxury, and the fantastic took a grim economic turn. Illuminations, confetti fluttering down to the streets from balloons. He enumerates. The subject is the festivities and gifts occasioned by the christening of Louis Napoleon's son. Colossal bonbonnières descending on parachutes. And what things the rich have. Beds of rosewood, shoots, and wardrobes, and hinges, and sliding mirrors, damask hangings, and over there the poor toiler. The link has been found, the antithesis obtained, the tremendous accusatory force, and an abundance of articles of furniture. Nikolai Gavrilovich exposes all their immortality. It is surprising that the seamstress, endowed with good looks, little by little slackens her moral principles. It is surprising that, having changed her cheap muslin dress, washed 100 times for her Alencon lace, and her sleepless nights of work by a bit of gutting candle for other sleepless nights at a public masquerade or at a suburban orgy, she whirling, etc. And having thought it over, he demolished the poet Nikitin, not because the latter versified badly, but because, being an inhabitant of the Voronezh backwoods, he had no right whatever to be talking about marble colonnades and sails. The German pedagogue Camp, following his little hands on his stomach, once said, "To spin a pound of wool is more useful than to write a volume of verses." We too, with equally stolid seriousness, are annoyed at poets as healthy fellows who would be better doing nothing, but who busy themselves with cutting trifles out of very nice colored paper. Get it clear, trickster, get it clear, arabesker. The power of art is the power of its commonplaces, and nothing more. What should interest a critic most is the conviction expressed in a writer's work. Volensky and Stranielewski both note a certain odd inconsistency here, one of the fatal inner contradictions that are revealed all along our hero's path. The dualism of the monist Chernyshevsky's aesthetics, where form and content are distinct, with content preeminent, or more exactly, with form playing the role of the soul, and content the role of the body, and the muddle is augmented by the fact that this soul consists of mechanical components, since Chernyshevsky believed that the value of a work was not a qualitative but quantitative concept, and that if someone were to take some miserable, forgotten novel and carefully cut all its flashes and observation, he would collect a fair number of sentences that would not differ in worth from those constituting the pages of works we admire. Even more, it is sufficient to take a look at the trinkets fabricated in Paris, at those elegant articles of bronze, porcelain, and wood, in order to understand how impossible it is nowadays to draw a line between an artistic and unartistic product. This elegant bronze explains a lot. Like words, things also have their cases. Chernyshevsky saw everything in the nominative. Actually, of course, any genuinely new trend is a knight's move, a change of shadows, a shift that displaces the mirror. A serious man, moderate, respecting education, art, and crafts, a man who has accumulated a profusion of values in the sphere of thought, who perhaps has shown a fully progressive discrimination during the period of their accumulation, but now has no desire whatsoever for them to be suddenly subjected to a reconsideration. Such a man is much more angered by the irrational innovation than by the darkness of antiquated ignorance. Thus Chernyshevsky, who like the majority of revolutionaries was a complete bourgeois in his artistic and scientific tastes, was enraged by the squaring of boots and the extraction of cubic roots from boot tops. All Kazan knew Lobachevsky, he wrote to his sons from Siberia in the 70s. Alcazan was of the unanimous opinion that the man was a complete fool. What on earth is the curvature of a ray or curved space? What is geometry without the axiom of parallel lines? It is possible to write Russian without verbs? Yes, it is, for a joke. Whispers, timid respiration, trills of nightingale, written by a certain Fett, a well-known poet in his time, an idiot with few peers. He wrote this seriously, and people laughed at him till their sides ached. Fett he detested, as he also did Tolstoy. In 1856, when buttering up Turgenev, whom he wanted in The Contemporary, he wrote him that no youth's Tolstoy childhood and adolescence, nor even Fett's poetry, can sufficiently vulgarize the public for its not being able to. There follows a vulgar compliment. Once in 1855, when expatiating on Pushkin and wishing to give an example of a senseless combination of words, he hastily cited a blue sound of his own invention, prophetically calling down upon his own head Bloch's blue-ringing hour that was to chime half a century later. A scientific analysis shows the absurdity of such combinations, he wrote, unaware of the physiological fact of colored hearing. Isn't it all the same, he asked of the reader in Bakhmutchansk or Novembergrad, who joyfully agreed with them, whether we have a blue-finned pike, or, as Derzhavin poem, a pike with a blue fin? Of course the second we would have cried. The way it stands out better in profile, for the genuine thinker has no time to worry about such matters, especially if he spends more time in the public square than he does in his study. The general outline is another matter. It was a love of generalities, encyclopedias, and contemptuous hatred of particularities, monographs, which led him to reproach Darwin for being puerile and Wallace for being inept. All these learned specialties, from the study of butterfly wings to the study of Kaffir dialects, Shereshevsky had, in the contrary, a dangerously wide range, a kind of reckless and self-confident anything-will-do attitude which casts a doubtful shadow over his own specialized work. The general interest, however, was given his own interpretation. The premise was that the reader was most of all interested in the productive side of things. Reviewing a magazine in 1855, he praises such items as the thermometric condition of the earth and the Russian coalfields, while decisively rejecting as too special the only article one would want to read, the geographical distribution of the camel. Extraordinarily indicative in respect of all this is Chernyshevsky's attempt to prove The Contemporary for 1856 that the ternary meter, Anapest, dactyl, is more natural to Russian than the binary one, I am, trochi. The first, except when it is used in the making of the noble, sacred, and therefore hateful, dactylic hexameter, seems more natural to Chernyshevsky, more wholesome, in the way that a bad writer thinks a gallop is simpler than trotting. The point, however, was not so much in this as in that general rule to which he subjected everything and everyone, confused by the rhythmic emancipation in Nekrasov's broad-rolling verse, and by Koltsov's elementary Anapest. Why sleep, muzhikyok? Chernyshevsky scented something democratic in the ternary meter, something which charmed the heart, something free but also didactic, as opposed to the aristocratic air of the iamb. He believed that poets who wished to convince should use the Anapest. However, this was not all. In Nekrasov's ternary verse it happens especially often that one-syllable or two-syllable words occur in the unstressed parts of the feet and lose their accentual individuality, where the collective rhythm, on the other hand, is heightened. The parts are sacrificed to the whole, as for instance in the Anapestic line Volga, Volga, and spring overflowing, where the first Volga occupies the two depressions of the first foot, Volga, Vol. All I have just said is nowhere, of course, examined by Chernyshevsky himself, but it is curious that in his own verses produced by him during the Siberian nights, in that terrible ternary meter, whose very shoddiness has a tang of madness about it, Chernyshevsky unwittingly parodies Nekrasov's device and carries it to absurdity by cramming into the depressions two-syllable words, normally accented not on their first syllable as Volga, but on the second, and doing it thrice in one line, surely a record. Remote hills, remote palms, surprised girl of the north, verses to his wife, 1875. Let us repeat all this learning toward a line, leaning toward a line, created in the image and likeness of definite socio-economic gods, was unconscious on Chernyshevsky's part, but it was only making its tendency clear that one can understand the true background of his strange theory. With all this, he had no understanding of the real violinic essence of the Anapest. Neither did he understand the I am, the most flexible of all measures when it comes to transforming stresses into sounds, into those rhythmical deviations from meter, which according to his memories for the seminary seemed to Shereshevsky unlawful. Finally, he did not understand the rhythm of Russian prose. It is only natural, therefore, that the very method he applied to prove his theory had its revenge on him. In the passages of prose he quoted, he divided the number of syllables by the number of stresses and got the result of 3. Not the 2 he would have got, he said, had the binary meter been more becoming to the Russian language, but he did not take into account the main thing, the paeans. For in the very passages he quotes, whole pieces of sentences follow the scudded rhythm of blank verse, the most blue-blooded of all meters, i.e. precisely the I am. I am afraid that the cobbler who visited Apili's studio and criticized what he did not understand was a mediocre cobbler. It is all really well from a mathematical point of view in those learned economic works of his, whose analysis demands an almost superhuman curiosity on the part of the investigator. Are they really deep, those commentaries on his mill, in which he strove to reconstruct certain theories in keeping in view of the plebeian element in thought and in life? Do all the boots he made really fit? Or is it merely an old man's coquetry which prompts him 20 years later to recall completely the errors in his logarithmic calculations concerning the effect of certain agricultural improvements on the grain harvest? Sad, all of this, very sad. Our overall impression is that materialists of the type fell into fatal error, neglecting the nature of the thing itself. They kept applying their most materialistic method merely to the relations between objects, to the void between objects, and not the objects themselves, i.e. they were the naivest metaphysicians precisely at that point where they most wanted to be standing on the ground. Once in his youth there had been an unfortunate morning. He was called on by a book peddler he knew, old long-nosed Vasily Trofimovich, who bent like a baba-yaga beneath the weight of a huge canvas sack full of prohibited and semi-prohibited books, not knowing foreign languages, hardly able to spell out Roman letters, and weirdly pronouncing the titles in a thick peasant way. He guessed instinctively the degree of seditiousness of this or that German. That morning he sold Nikolai Gavrilovich, both of them squatting on their haunches beside a pile of books, a still uncut volume of Feuerbach. In those days, Andrei Ivanovich Feuerbach was preferred to Igor Fedorovich Hegel. Homo Feuerbach is a cogitating muscle. Andrei Ivanovich found that the man differs from the ape only in his point of view. He could hardly, however, have studied the apes. A half-century after him, Lenin refuted the theory that the earth is the sum of human sensations. With "the earth existed before man did," and to his trade announcement, we now turn Kant's unknowable thing in itself into a thing for us by means of organic chemistry. He added quite seriously that since alizarin has existed in coal without our knowledge, then things must exist independently of their cognition. Similarly, Shereshevsky explained, we see a tree, another man looks at the same object. We see the reflection in his eyes that his image of the tree looks exactly the same as our tree. Thus we all see objects as they really exist. All this wild rubbish has its own private hilarious twist. The materialist's constant appeal to trees is especially amusing because they are also badly acquainted with nature, particularly with trees. The tangible object which, according to Shereshevsky, acts much more thoroughly than the abstract concept of it, the anthropological principle in philosophy, is simply beyond their ken. Look what a terrible abstraction resulted, the final analysis from materialism. Shereshevsky did not know the difference between a plow and the wooden soha. He confused beer with Madeira. He was unable to name a single wild flower except the wild rose, and it is characteristic that this deficiency of botanical knowledge was immediately made up by a generalization that he maintained with a conviction of ignoramus, that they, the flowers of the Siberian taiga, are all just the same as those which bloom all over Russia. There lurks a secret retribution in the fact that he who had constructed his philosophy on a basis of knowing the world was now placed, naked and alone, amidst the bewitched, strangely luxuriant, and still incompletely described nature of northeast Siberia, an elemental mythological punishment which had not been taken into account by his human judges. Only a few years earlier, the smell of Gogol's Petrushka had been explained away by the fact that everything existing was rational, but the time for hearty Russian Hegelianism was now past. The molders of opinion were incapable of understanding Hegel's vile truth, a truth that was not stagnant like shallow water, but flowed like blood through the very process of cognition. The simpleton Feuerbach was much more to Shereshevsky's taste. There is always a danger, however, that one letter will fall out of cosmic, and this danger was not evaded by Shereshevsky in his article Communal Ownership, when he began to operate with Hegel's tempting triad, giving such examples as the gasiformity of the world is the thesis, while the softness of the brain is the synthesis, or even stupider, a cudgel turning into a carbine. There lies concealed in the triad, said Stranyolubsky, a vague image of the circumference controlling all the life of the mind, and the mind is confined inescapably within it. This is truth's merry-go-round, for truth is always round. Consequently, in the development of life's forms, a certain pardonable curvature is possible, the hump of truth, but no more. Chernyshevsky's philosophy goes back through the Feuerbach to the Encyclopedists. On the other hand, applied Hegelianism, working gradually left, went through the same Feuerbach to join Marx, who in his Holy Family expresses himself thus: no great intelligence is needed to distinguish a connection between the teaching of materialism regarding inborn tendency to good, equality of man's capacities that generally are termed mental, the great influence exterior circumstances have on man, omnipotent experience, sway of habit, and of upbringing, the extreme importance of industry, the moral right to pleasure, and communism. I have to put it into blank verse, so it would be less boring. Steklov is of the opinion that, with all this genius, Chernyshevsky cannot rank with Marx, in relation to whom he stands as the Barnaul craftsman. Pulzhanov stands to Watt, Marx himself the petty bourgeois, to the marrow of his bones, according to the testimony of Bakunin, who could not stand Germans, referred once or twice to the remarkable writings of Chernyshevsky, but he left more than one contemptuous note in the margins of the chief work on economics, De Grossen, Richischen, Gellert, and Marx in general disliked Russians. Chernyshevsky repaid him in like coin. Already in the 70s, he was treating everything new with negligence, with malevolence. He was particularly fed up with economics, which had ceased to be a weapon for him, and by this token took on in his mind the aspect of an empty toy, of pure science. Latsky is quite wrong when, with a passion for navigational analogies common to many, he compares the exiled Chernyshevsky to a man watching from a deserted shore the passage of a gigantic ship, Marx's ship, on its way to discover new lands. The expression is especially unfortunate in view of the fact that Chernyshevsky himself, as if anticipating the analogy and wishing to refute it in advance, said of Das Kapital, sent to him in 1872, I glanced through it but didn't read it. I tore off the pages one by one and made them into little ships, my italics, and launched them on the Viliui. Lenin considered Chernyshevsky to be the one truly great writer who managed to remain on a level of unbroken philosophical materialism for the 50s right up until 1888. He knocked 1 year off. Once, on a windy day, Krupskaya turned to Lunacharsky and said to him with a soft sorrow, "There's hardly anyone Vladimir Ilyich liked so much, and I think he had a great deal in common with Chernyshevsky." "Yes, they undoubtedly have much in common," said Lunacharsky, who had tended at first to treat this remark with skepticism. They had in common both clarity of style and mobility of speech, breadth and depth of judgment, revolutionary fire, that combination of enormous content with the modest exterior, and finally their joint moral makeup. Steklov calls Chernyshevsky's article the anthropological principle in philosophy, the first philosophical manifesto of Russian communism. It is significant that the first manifesto is a schoolboy's rendering, an infantile assessment of the most difficult moral questions. The European theory of materialism, says Stranyolubsky, rephrasing Volinsky somewhat, took on with Chernyshevsky a simplified, muddled, and grotesque form, passing scornful and impertinent judgment on Schopenhauer, under whose critical fingernail his own saltatory thinking would not have survived for a second. He recognized out of all former thinkers, by a strange association of ideas and according to his mistaken memories, only Spinoza and Aristotle, whom he imagined himself to be continuing. Chernyshevsky hammered unsound syllogisms together. The moment he had gone, the syllogisms collapsed and the nails were left sticking out. In eliminating metaphysical dualism, he fell into gnoseological dualism, and having light-heartedly taken matter as the first principle, he got hopelessly lost among the concepts presupposing something that creates our perception of the external world itself. The professional philosopher Yurkevich had no trouble at all in pulling him to pieces. Yurkevich kept wondering, how does Chernyshevsky account for the spatial motion of the nerves being transformed into non-spatial sensation? Instead of replying to the poor professor's detailed article, Chernyshevsky reprinted exactly a third of it in the Contemporary, i.e., as much as was allowed by law, and broke it off in the middle of a word, with no comment. He most definitely did not give a hoot for the opinions of specialists, and he saw no harm in not knowing the details of the subject under examination. Details were for him merely the aristocratic element in the nation of our general ideas. His head thinks about the problems of humanity, while his hand carries out the unskilled labor, he wrote of his socially conscious workmen. And we cannot help recalling those woodcuts and ancient anatomical atlases, where a pleasant-faced youth is depicted nonchalantly leaning against a column and showing the educated world all his viscera. But the political regime that was supposed to appear in the synthesis of syllogism, where the thesis was the commune, resembled not so much Soviet Russia as the utopias of his day, the world of Fourier, the harmony of the 12 passions, the bliss of collective living, the rose-garlanded work of men. All this could not fail to please Chernyshevsky, who was always looking for coherency. Let us dream out of the phalanstery living in a palace, 1,800 souls, and all happy, music, flags, cakes. The world is run by mathematics, and well read at that. The correspondence which Fourier established between our desires and Newton's gravity was particularly captivating. It defined Chernyshevsky's attitude to Newton for all his life, and it is pleasant to compare the latter's apple with Fourier's apple, costing the commercial traveler a whole 14 sous in Paris restaurant. In fact, that led just as Marx was led to acquaint himself with economic problems by the questions of wine-making gnomes, small peasants in the Moselle Valley, a graceful origination of grandiose ideas. While defending communal ownership of the land because of its simplifying the organization of associations in Russia, Chernyshevsky was prepared to agree to the emancipation of the peasants without land, the ownership of which would have led to the long run to new encumbrances. At this point, sparks flash from our pen. The liberation of the serfs, the era of great reforms. No wonder that in a burst of vivid prescience, the young Chernyshevsky noted in his diary of 1848, the year somebody dubbed the event of the century, "What if we are indeed living in the times of Cicero and Caesar, when secularum novus nascitur odoru, and there comes a new Messiah and a new religion and a new world." The 50s are now in full fan. It is permitted to smoke on the streets. One may wear a beard. The overture to William Tell is thundered out on every musical occasion. Rumors spread that the capital is being moved to Moscow, that the old calendar is going to be replaced by the new. Under the cover, Russia is busily gathering material for Saltykov's primitive but juicy satire. "What is this talk of a new spirit in the air, I'd like to know," said General Zubatov. "Only the flunkies have grown rude, otherwise everything has stayed the way it was." Landowners, and notably their wives, began to dream terrible dreams not listed in dream books. A new hearsay appeared, nihilism, a scandalous and immoral doctrine, rejecting everything that cannot be palpated, said Dahl with a shudder, and his definition of the strange word in which nihil, nothing, corresponds as it were to material. Persons and holy orders had a vision. An enormous Chernyshevsky strides along the Nevsky Prospect, wearing a wide-brimmed hat and carrying a cudgel, and that first rescript in the name of the Vilno governor, Natsimov, and the Tsar's signature, so handsome, so robust, with two full-blooded, mighty flourishes, which were to be later torn off by a bomb, and the ecstasy of Nikolai Gavrilovich, the blessing promised to the meek and the peacemakers, crowns Alexander II with a happiness which no other of Europe's sovereigns has yet known. But soon after the provincial committees were formed, Chernyshevsky's ardor cooled. He was incensed by the self-seeking of the nobles and the most of them. His final disillusionment came in the second half of 1858. The size of the compensation, the smallness of the allotments, the tone of the Contemporary became sharp and frank. The expressions infamous and infamy began pleasantly to enliven the pages of this dullish magazine. Its director's life was not rich in events. For a long time the public did not know his face. Nowhere was he seen. Already famous, he remained as it were on the wings of his busy, talkative thought, always, as was the custom then, in a dressing gown, spotted even behind with candle grease. He sat all day long in his little study with its blue wallpaper, good for the eyes, and his window overlooking the yard, a view of log pile covered with snow, at a large desk heaped with books, printers' proofs, and cuttings. He worked so feverishly, smoked so much, and slept so little, that the impression he produced was almost frightening. Skinny, nervy, his gaze had once blear and piercing, his hands shaky, his speech jerky and distracted. On the other hand, he never suffered from headache, and naively boasted of this as a mark of healthy mind. His capacity for work was monstrous, as well as, for that matter, that most Russian critics of the last century. To his secretary Studentsky, a former seminarist from Saratov, he dictated a translation of Chaucer's history and in between, and while the latter was taking it down, he himself would go on writing an article for the Contemporary, or would read something, making notes in the margins. He was pestered by callers, not knowing how to escape from an importunate guest. He would, to his own chagrin, get more and more involved in the conversation, leaning his elbow on the mantelpiece and fiddling with something. He would talk in a shrill, squeaky voice, but whenever his thoughts wandered, he would drawl and chew monotonously, with an abundance of wells. He had a peculiar, quiet chuckle, causing Leo Tolstoy to break into a sweat, but when he laughed out loud, he went off into fits and roared deafeningly, at which Turgenev, hearing these relayed from afar, would take to his heels. Such methods of knowledge as dialectical materialism curiously resemble the unscrupulous advertisements for patent medicines which cure all illnesses at once. Still, such an expedient could occasionally help with a cold. There was quite definitely a smack of class arrogance about the attitudes of contemporary well-born writers toward plebeian Chernyshevsky. Turgenev, Grigorovitch, and Tolstoy called him the bedbug-stinking gentleman, and among themselves jeered at him in all kinds of ways. Once at Turgenev's country place, the first two, together with Bakin and Druzhinin, composed and acted a domestic farce. In a scene where a couch was supposed to catch fire, Turgenev had come out running with the cry. Here the common efforts of his friends had persuaded him to utter the unfortunate words, which in his youth he had allegedly addressed to a sailor during a fire on board a ship. Save me, I am my mother's only son. Out of this farce, the utterly talentless Grigorovitch subsequently concocted his completely mediocre School of Hospitality, where he endowed one of the characters, the splenetic writer Shermoshin. The features of Nikolai Gavrilovitch, mole's eyes looking oddly askance, thin lips, a flattened, crumpled face, gingery hair fluffed up on the left temple with an euphemistic stench of burnt rum. It is curious that the notorious wail, "Save me," etc., is attributed here to Chernyshyn, which gives color to Stanislawski's idea that there was a kind of mystic link between Turgenev and Chernyshevsky. "I have read his disgusting book, The Dissertation," writes the former in a letter to his fellow markers. Raka, you know there is nothing in the world more terrible than this Jewish curse. This Raka, or Raka, remarks the biographer superstitiously, resulted 7 years later in Rakiv, the police colonel who had arrested the anathemized Ben. And the letter itself had been written by Turgenev on precisely the 12th of July, Chernyshevsky's birthday. It seems to us that Stanislawski is stretching it a bit. The same year, Turgenev's Rudin appeared, but Chernyshevsky attacked it for its caricature of Bakunin. Only in 1860, when Turgenev was no longer necessary to the Contemporary, which he had left as a result of Dobrolyubov's directing a snake hiss at his On the Eve, Tolstoy could not tolerate our hero. "One keeps hearing him," he wrote, "hearing that thin, nasty little voice of his saying obtuse, nasty things, as he keeps waxing indignant in the corner, until someone says, 'Shut up,' and looks him in the eye. The aristocrats turned into coarse ruffians," remarks Steklov in connection, "when they talked with inferiors or about people who were inferior to them socially." The inferior, however, did not remain in debt. Knowing how much Turgenev prized every word spoken against Tolstoy, Chernyshevsky in the 50s freely enlarged upon Tolstoy's postost, vulgarity, and vostrovol, bragging. The bragging of a thick-headed peacock about a tail which doesn't even cover its vulgar bottom, etc. "You are not some Ostrovsky or some Tolstoy," added Nikolai Gavrilovitch. "You are an honor to us." The Rudin was already out, and had been out for 2 years. The other literary reviews picked at him as much as they could. The critic Dudishkin, the national commentator, huffily aimed his Dadin at him. Poetry for you is merely chapters of political economy transposed into verse. His ill-wishers in the mystical camp spoke about Chernyshevsky's evil lore, about his physical resemblance to the devil, for instance, Professor Kostomarov. Other journalists of a plainer cast, like Blagoslatov, who considered himself a dandy and despite his radicalism had a footboy, a real undyed blackamoor, talked about Chernyshevsky's dirty rubbers and German Kumsexton's style of dress. Nekrasov stood up for the sensible fellow whom he had got for the contemporary, with a limp smile, admitting that he had managed to lay the stamp of monotony on the magazine by stuffing it with mediocre tales, denouncing bribe-taking and policemen. But he praised the colleague for his fruitful labors. Thanks to him, the magazine had 4,700 subscribers in 1858, and 3 years later, 7,000. Nikolai Gavrilovich's relations with Nekrasov were friendly but no more. There was a hint concerning some financial arrangements which displeased him. In 1883, in order to divert the old man, his cousin Pippin suggested that he should write some portraits of the past. Chernyshevsky depicted his first meeting with Nekrasov with meticulousness and laboriousness already familiar to us, giving a complex plan of all their mutual movements about the room, including practically the number of footsteps, a detailism sounding like an insult inflicted on Father Time and his honest work, if one remembers that 30 years had elapsed since these maneuvers took place. He placed Nekrasov, the poet, above all others, above Pushkin, above Lermontov, above Kolstov. La Traviata made linen weep. Similarly, Chernyshevsky, who confessed that poetry of the heart was even dearer to him than poetry of ideas, used to burst into tears over those of Nekrasov's verses, even iambic ones, which expressed everything he himself had experienced, all the torments of his youth and all the phrases of his love for his wife. And no wonder, Nekrasov's iambic pentameter enchants us particularly by its hortatory, supplicatory and prophetic force, and by a very individual caesura of the second foot, a caesura which in Pushkin say is a rudimentary organ insofar as it controls the melody of the line, but which in Nekrasov becomes a genuine organ of breathing, as if it had turned from partition into a pit, or as if the 2-foot part of the line and the 3-foot part had moved asunder, leaving after the second foot an interval full of music. As he listened to these hollow-chested verses, to this guttural, sobbing articulation, "Oh, do not say the life you lead is dismal. Oh, do not call a jailer one half dead. Before me night chills yawns chilly and abysmal, the arms of love before you are outspread. I know to you another is now dearer. It irks you now to spare me and to wait. Oh, bear with me, my end is drawing near. Let fate complete what is begun by fate." Chernyshevsky could not help thinking that his wife should not hasten to deceive him, could not help identifying the nearness and the end with the shadow of the prison already stretching out toward him. And that was not all. Evidently his connection was felt, not in the rational but in the Orphic sense, also by the poet who wrote these lines, for it is precisely their rhythm, "Oh, do not say," that was echoed with a bizarre haunting quality in the poem he subsequently wrote about Chernyshevsky. "Oh, do not say his forgotten caution, for his own fate himself he'll be to blame." Thus Nekrasov's sounds were pleasing to Chernyshevsky, i.e. they happened to satisfy that elementary aesthetic for which he mistook all along his own circumstantial sentimentality, having described a large circle, having taken in many matters concerning Chernyshevsky's attitude to various branches of knowledge, and yet not having impaired for a moment our smooth curve, we have now returned with new forces to his philosophy of art. Now it is time to sum it up. Like all the rest of our radical critics, having weakness for easy gain, he eschewed courtly compliments to lady writers, and energetically demolished Evolkia Rostopchin and Avdotia Glinka. An incorrect and careless patter, as Pushkin puts it, left him unmoved. Both he and Dobrolyubov played literary coquettes with gusto, but in real life, well, look what was done to them. Look how they were twisted and tortured with peals of laughter, water nymphs laughing thus along streams swelling close to hermitages and other places of salvation by the daughters of Dr. Vasilev. His tastes were eminently solid. He was épaté by Hugo. He was impressed by Swinburne, which was not at all strange, come to think of it. In the list of books which he read in the fortress, the name of Flaubert is spelled with an O, and indeed he placed him below Zacher Masoch and Spielhagen. He loved Beranger, and the average Frenchman loved him. "For goodness' sake," exclaimed Steklov, "you say this man is not poetic? Why, do you not know that he would declaim Beranger and Ryleyev with tears of rapture? He tastes only congealed in Siberia, and by a strange delicacy of historical fate, Russia did not produce during the 20 years of his banishment a single genuine writer until Chekhov, whose beginning he had not seen for himself during the active period of his life. From conversations with him in the 80s in Astrakhan, it became apparent that, yes, sir, it is the title of count that made one consider Tolstoy a great writer of the Russian land. And when bothersome visitors asked him whom he thought the best living writer, he named complete nonentity Maxim Belinsky. In his youth, he noted in his diary, political literature is the highest literature. In the 50s, he was discussing at length Belinsky, Vissarion, of course, something the government disapproved of. He followed him in saying that literature cannot fail to be the handmaiden of one or another ideological trend, and that writers incapable of being animated by sympathy toward what is being accomplished around us by the force of historical movement will never in any circumstances produce anything great. For history does not know of any works of art that were created exclusively from the idea of beauty. In the 40s, Belinsky maintained that George Sand can unconditionally be included in the role of European poets in the German sense of Dichter, while the juxtaposition of Gogol's name with those of Homer and Shakespeare offends both decency and common sense, and that not only Cervantes, Walter Scott, and Cooper, as artists preeminently, but also Swift, Sterne, Voltaire, and Rousseau, have an incomparably and immeasurably greater significance in the whole history of literature than Gogol. Belinsky was seconded 3 decades later by the Shereshevsky, when it is true George Sand had already ascended to the attic and Cooper had descended to the nursery, who said that Gogol is a very minor figure in comparison, for example, with Dickens or Fielding or Sterne. Poor Gogol! His exclamation, like Pushkin's rush, is willingly repeated by the men of the 60s. By now the Troika needs paved highways, for even Rushka's Toska yearning has become utilitarian. Poor Gogol! Esteeming the seminarist with the critic Nadezhin, who used to write literature with 3 T's. Shereshevsky founded that his influence on Gogol would have been more beneficial than Pushkin's, and regretted that Gogol was not aware of such a thing as a principle. Poor Gogol! Why, that gloomy buffoon, Father Matvey, had also adjured him to renounce Pushkin. Lermontov came off luckier. His prose jerked from Belinsky, who had a weakness for the conquest of technology, the surprising, the most charming comparison of Pechorin to a steam engine shattering all who were careless enough to get under his wheels. In his poetry, the middle-class intellectuals felt something of the socio-lyrical strain that later came to be called Nadsonism. In this sense, Lermontov was the first Nadson of Russian literature. The rhythm, the tone, the pale, tear-diluted idiom of civic verse, to and including its victims, you fell in the faithful contest. The famous revolutionary song of the first years of our century, all of this goes back to such Lermontov lines as, "Farewell, our dear comrade. Alas, upon earth not long did you dwell, blue-eyed singer. A plain cross of wood you have earned, and with us your memory always shall linger." Lermontov's real magic, the melting vistas in his poetry, its paradisial picturesqueness in the transparent ting of celestial in his moist verse, these, of course, were completely inaccessible to the understanding of men of Shereshevsky's stamp. Now we are approaching the most vulnerable spot, for it has long become customary to measure the degree of flair, intelligence, and talent of a Russian critic by his attitude to Pushkin, and this is how it will remain until Russian literary criticism discards its sociological, religious, philosophical, and other textbooks which only help mediocrity to admire itself. Only then will you be free to say what you please. You may then criticize Pushkin for any betrayals of his exigent muse, and at the same time preserve both your talent and your honor. Upbraid him from letting 1 hexameter creep into the petrometers of Boris Godunov, 9th scene, for a metrical error in the 21st line of the feast during the plague, for repeating the phrase every minute, "Pomnuturo," 5 times within 16 lines of the blizzard, or for God's sake, stop that irrelevant chit-chat. Stranyulupsky sagaciously compares the critical utterances of the 60s concerning Pushkin with the attitude to him 3 decades earlier of the chief of police Count Benchkadorf, or that of the director of the 3rd section von Fock. In truth, Shereshevsky's highest praise for a writer, like for that the Nicholas I. and radical Belinsky, was sensible. When Shereshevsky or Pisarev called Pushkin's poetry rubbish and luxury, they were only repeating Tolmachev, author of military eloquence, who in the 30s had termed the same subject trifles and baubles. When Shereshevsky said that Pushkin was only a poor imitator of Byron, he reproduced with monstrous accuracy the definition given by Count Vorontsov Pushkin's boss in Odessa, a poor imitator of Lord Byron. Duboliev's favorite idea that Pushkin lacked a solid, deep education is in friendly chime with Vorontsov's remark, one cannot be a genuine poet without constantly working to broaden one's knowledge, and his is insufficient. To be a genius, it is not enough to have manufactured Eugene Onegin, write the progressive Nadezhdin, comparing Pushkin to a tailor or an inventor of waistcoat patterns, and thus concluding an intellectual pact with the reactionary Count Uvarov, Minister of Education, who remarked on the occasion of Pushkin's death, to write jingles does not mean yet to achieve a great career. Chernyshevsky equated genius with common sense. If Pushkin was a genius, he argued perplexedly, then how should one interpret the profusion of corrections in his drafts? One can understand some polishing in a fair copy, but this was the rough work itself. It should have flowed effortless, since common sense speaks its mind immediately, or it knows what it wants to say. Moreover, as a person ridiculously alien to artistic creation, he supposed that polishing took place on paper while the real work, i.e. the task of forming the general plan, occurred in the mind. Another side of that dangerous dualism, the crack in his materialism, whence more than one snake had slithered to bite him during his life. Pushkin's originality filled in with fears. Poetic works are good when everyone, my italics, says after reading them, yes, this is not only versimilar, but also could not be otherwise, for that is how it always is. Pushkin does not figure out in a list of books sent to Chernyshevsky at the fortress, and no wonder, despite Pushkin's services, he invented Russian poetry and taught society to read it. Two statements completely untrue, he was nevertheless, above all, a writer of witty little verses about women's little feet, an intonation of the 60s, when the whole nature had been Philistinized into Travka, diminutive of grass, and Puchushki, diminutive of birds, already meant something quite different from Pushkin's petit beats, something that had now become closer to the mawkish Fushin. It seemed particularly astonishing to him, as it did to Belinsky, that Pushkin became so aloof toward the end of his life. At the end he was put to those friendly relations whose monument has remained the poem Aryan, explained to Chernyshevsky in passing, but now full of sacred meaning was this casual reference to the forbidden subject of Decemberism, for the reader of the Contemporary, whom we suddenly imagined as absent-mindedly and hungrily biting into an apple, transferring the hunger of his reading into the apple, and again the words with his eyes. Therefore, Nikolai Gavrilovich must have been more than a little irritated by a stage direction in the penultimate scene of Boris Godunov, a stage direction resembling a sly hint and encroachment upon civic laurels hardly deserved by the author of vulgar drivel. See Chernyshevsky's remarks on the poem Stambul is the Tsar's now lauded. Pushkin comes surrounded by the people. Reading over the most abusive critics, wrote Pushkin during an autumn at Boldino, I find them so amusing that I don't understand how I could have been angry at them. Meseems, if I wanted to laugh at them, I could think nothing better than to just reprint them with no comment at all. Curiously enough, that is exactly what Chernyshevsky did with Professor Yurkovich's article, a grotesque repetition, and now a revolving speck of dust has got caught in a ray of Pushkin light, which has penetrated between the blinds of Russian critical thought, to use Janulubsky's caustic metaphor. We have in mind the following magic gamut of fate. In his Saratov diary, Chernyshevsky applied 2 lines from Pushkin's The Egyptian Nights to his courtship, completely misquoting the second one, with a characteristic for him he had no ear, distortion. He met the challenge of delight. As Wayfarer's challenge met, I'd have, instead of as we would meet in the days of war, the challenge of a savage battle. For this I'd have. Fate, the ally of the Muses, and herself an expert in conditional forms, took revenge on him, and with what refined stealth in the evolution of the punishment. What connection, it seems, could be there between this ill-starred misquotation of Chernyshevsky's remark 10 years later, in 1862, if people were able to announce all their ideas concerning public affairs at meetings, there would be no need to make magazine articles out of them? However, at this point, Nemesis is already awakening. Instead of writing, one would speak, continues Chernyshevsky, and if these ideas had to reach everyone who had not taken part in the meeting, they could be noted down by a stenographer. And vengeance unfolds in Siberia, where his only listeners were the Larchers and the Yakuts. He was haunted by the image of the platform in the lecture hall, in which it was so convenient for the public to gather, and where the latter would ripple so responsibly, for in the final analysis he, as Pushkin's improvisator, he of the Egyptian Nights, but a poorer versificator, he had chosen for his profession, and later an unrealizable ideal, variations on a given theme. In the very twilight of his life he composes a work in which he embodies his dream. From Astrakhan, not long before his death, he sends Lavrov his evenings at the Princess Staroblitsky's, the literary review of the Russian thought, which he did not find it possible to print then, and follows this up with an insertion addressed straight to the printer. And that part where it says that people have gone from the salon dining room into the salon proper, which has been prepared for them to listen to Vysorovsky's fairy tale. There is a description of the arrangement of the auditorium, the distribution of the male and female stenographers into two sections at two tables either is not indicated or else is indicated unsatisfactorily. In my draft, this reads as follows. Along the sides of the platform stood two tables for the stenographers. Vysorovsky went up to the stenographers, shook hands with them, and stood chatting with them while the company took their places. The lines of the fair copy, whose sense corresponds to the passage quoted from my draft, should be replaced now by the following lines. The men, forming a constricted frame, stood near the stage, and along the walls behind the last chairs, the musicians with their stands occupied both sides of the stage, the improvisator, greeted by the deafening applause rising from all sides. Sorry, we mixed everything up. We got hold of an extract from Pushkin's The Egyptian Nights. Let us restore the situation between the platform and the foremost hemicycle of the auditorium, writes Chernyshevsky to a non-existent printer. A little to the right and left of the platform stood two tables. At one which was on the left in front of the platform, if you looked from the middle of the hemicycles toward the platform, etc., etc., with many more words of the same sort, none of them really expressing anything. Here is the thing for you, said Sharsky to the improvisator. The poet himself chooses the subjects for his poems. The multitude has no right to direct his inspiration. We have been led a long way by the impetus and revolution of the Pushkin theme in Chernyshevsky's life. Meanwhile, a new character, whose name once or twice has already burst impatiently into our discourse, is awaiting his entrance. Now it is just time for him to appear, and here he comes in the tightly buttoned, blue-collared regulation coat of a university student, fairly reeking of chesnost, progressive principle. Ungainly, with tiny, short-sighted eyes and scanty Newport frill, the barbe and collier, which seemed so symptomatic to Flaubert, he offers his hand, jab-wise, i.e. thrusting it oddly forward with the thumb turned out, and introduces himself in a catarrhally confidential little bass, Dobrolyubov. The first meeting, summer 1856, was recalled almost 30 years later by Chernyshevsky, when he also wrote about Nekrasov, with his familiar wealth of detail essentially sickly and impotent. But supposed to set off the irreproachability of thought and its transactions with time, friendship joined these two men in a monogrammatic union which the 100 centuries are incompetent to unite. On the contrary, it becomes even faster in the consciousness of posterity. This is not the place to enlarge upon the literary activities of the younger men. Let us merely say that he was uncouthly crude and uncouthly naive, that in the satirical review, The Whistle, he poked fun at the distinguished Dr. Pirogov, while parodying Lermontov, the use of some Lermontov's lyrical poems as canvas for journalistic jokes about the people and events was in general so widespread that in the long run it turned into a caricature of the very art of parody. Let us say also that it's Chernyshevsky's words, that from the push given it by Dobrolyubov, the literature rolled down an inclined plane with the inevitable result, once it had rolled to zero, that it was put into inverted commas. The student brought some literature, meaning propaganda leaflets. What else can one add? Dobrolyubov's humor? Oh, these blessed times when mosquito is in itself funny. A mosquito settling on someone's nose twice as funny, and a mosquito flying into a governmental office and being a civil servant caused the listeners to groan and double up with laughter. Much more engaging than Dobrolyubov's obtuse and ponderous critique, all this played of radical critics in fact wrote with their feet, is the frivolous side of his real life. That feverish romantic sportiveness which subsequently supplied Chernyshevsky with the material for the love intrigues of Levitsky, the prologue. Dobrolyubov was extraordinarily prone to falling in love, and here we could catch a glimpse of him playing assiduously Durachki, a simple card game, with a much decorated general whose daughter he courts. He had a German girl in Staraya Russia, a strong, onerous tie from immoral visits to her. Chernyshevsky held him back from the full sense of the word. For a long time they would wrestle, most of them limp, scrawny, sweaty, toppling all over the floor, colliding with the furniture, all the time silent. All you could hear was their wheezing. Then stumbling into one another, they would both search for their spectacles beneath the upturned chairs. At the beginning of 1859, gossip reached Chernyshevsky that Dobrolyubov, just like Danton's, in order to cover his intrigue with Olga Sokratovna, wanted to marry her sister, who already had a fiancé. Both the young women played outrageous tricks on Dobrolyubov. They took him to masked balls dressed as Capuchin or an ice cream vendor and confided all their secrets in him. Walks with Olga Sokratovna completely bemused him. "I know there is nothing to be gained here," he wrote to a friend, "because not a single conversation goes by without her mentioning that although I am a good man, nevertheless I am too clumsy and almost repulsive. I understand that I should not try to gain anything anyway, since in any case I am fonder of Nikolai Gavrilovitch than of her, but at the same time I am powerless to leave her alone." When he heard the gossip, Nikolai Gavrilovitch, who entertained no illusions concerning his wife's morals, still felt some resentment. The betrayal was a double one. He and Dobrolyubov had a frank explanation, and soon afterwards he sailed to London to maul Herzen, as he subsequently expressed it, i.e. to give him a good scolding for his attacks on that same Dobrolyubov and the Kolokol, the Bell, a liberal periodical published abroad, but of less radical views than the endemic Contemporary. Perhaps, however, the object of this meeting was not only intercede for his friend. Dobrolyubov's name, especially later in connection with his death, Chernyshevsky very skillfully handled as a matter of revolutionary tactics. According to certain reports from the past, his main object in visiting Herzen was to discuss the publishing of the Contemporary abroad. Everyone had a premonition that soon it would be closed down, but in general this trip was surrounded with such haste that has left now so few traces of Chernyshevsky's writings that one would almost prefer, in spite of the facts, to consider it apocryphal. He who had always been interested in England, who had nourished his soul on Dickens and his mind on the Times, how avidly he should have gulped it down, how many impressions he should have garnered, how insistently he should have kept turning back to it in memory, and actually Chernyshevsky never spoke of his journey whenever anyone really pressed him. He would reply briefly, "Well, what's there to talk about? There was a fog, the ship rocked, what else could there be?" Thus life itself, how many times now, refuted his axiom. The tangible object acts much more strongly than the abstract concept of it. However that may have been, on the 26th June, New Style, 1859, Chernyshevsky arrived in London. Everyone thought that he was in Saratov, and stayed there until the 30th. An oblique ray pierces the fog of these 4 days. Madame Chuchkov, Olgoryov, walks through a drawing room and into a sunny garden, carrying in her arms her year-old baby girl dressed in a little lace pelerine. In the drawing room, the action takes place in Putney, in Herzen's house. Alexander Ivanovich is walking back and forth. These indoor walks were very much the thing in those days. With a gentleman of medium height, whose face is unattractive, but illumined by a wonderful expression of self-abnegation and submissiveness to fate, which most likely was merely a trick of the memoirist's memory, recalling that face through the prism of fate, which had already been accomplished. Herzen introduced his companion to her. Chernyshevsky stroked the infant's hair, and said in his quiet voice, "I also have some like this, but I hardly ever see them." He used to confuse the names of his children. Little Victor was in Saratov, where he soon died. For the fate of his children does not forgive such slips of the pen, but he sent a kiss to little Sasha, who had already been brought back to Petersburg. "Say how do you do, give us your hand," said Herzen rapidly, and then immediately began to reply to something that had been said by Chernyshevsky. "Yes, exactly, that's what they sent them to the Siberian mines." While Madame Zhukov floated into the garden, and the oblique ray was extinguished forever. Diabetes and nephritis added to the tuberculosis soon put an end to Dobrolyubov. He was dying at the late autumn of 1861. Chernyshevsky paid him a daily call, and from there he went about his conspiratorial affairs, which were amazingly well concealed from police spies. It is generally considered that he was the author of the proclamation to the serfs of landowners. There is not much talk recalls Shogunov, who wrote the one to the soldiers, and evidently not even Vladislav Kostomarov, who printed these appeals, knew with any certainty about Chernyshevsky's authorship. Their style is very reminiscent of Count Rostopchin's corny little placards against Napoleon's invasion. So this is what it comes to, this through true freedom. And let courts be just, and let all alike before justice, and that's what the sense of kicking up a ruction in the village only. If this was written by Chernyshevsky, incidentally, ruction, as vulgar word, it was in any case touched up by someone else. According to information stemming from the People's Freedom Organization, Chernyshevsky suggested to Sleptsov and his friends in July 1861 that they form a basic cell of 5, the nucleus of an underground society. The system consisted of every member forming, moreover, his own cell and thus knowing only 8 people. Only the center knew all the members. All the members were only known to Chernyshevsky. This account does not seem free from some stylization. But let us repeat, he was ideally cautious. After the student disorders of October 1861, he was put under permanent surveillance, but the agent's work was not distinguished for its subtlety. Nikolai Gavrilovich had as a cook the wife of the house janitor, a tall, red-cheeked old woman with a somewhat unexpected name, Musa. She was bribed with no trouble 5 rubles for coffee, to which he was much addicted. In return, Musa used to supply the police with the contents of the employee's wastebasket. Meanwhile, on November 17, 1861, at 25 years of age, Dobrolyubov died. He was buried in the Volkov cemetery in a simple oak coffin. The coffin in such cases is always simple. Next to Volinsky, suddenly there stepped forth an energetic, clean-shaven gentleman, recalls a witness. Chernyshevsky's appearance was still unfamiliar, and since few people had gathered, and this irritated him, he started to speak of it with a detailed irony. While he was speaking, Olga Sokotovna shook with tears, leaning upon the arm of one of those devoted students who were always with her. Another, besides his own regulation cap, held the raccoon cap of the boss, who was with his fur coat unbuttoned in spite of the frost, took out an exercise book and began in an angry, didactic voice to read from it Dobrolyubov's lumpy gray poems about honest principles and approaching death. Hoarfrost shone on the birches, and a little to one side, next to the doddering mother of one of the gravediggers, in new felt boots, felt of humility, stood an agent of the secret police. Yes, concluded Chernyshevsky, we are not concerned here with the fact that the censorship, by cutting his articles to bits, brought Dobrolyubov to a disease of the kidneys. For his own glory he did enough. For his own sake he had no reason to live longer. For men of such caste and with such aspirations, life has nothing but burning grief to offer. Honest principles, that was his fatal illness. And pointing with his rolled-up notebook to an adjacent empty place on the other side, Chernyshevsky exclaimed, there is not a man in Russia worthy of occupying that grave. There was. It was occupied soon afterwards by Pisarev. It is difficult to escape the impression that Chernyshevsky, who in his youth had dreamed of being the leader of a national uprising, was now reveling in the rarefied air of danger surrounding him. The significance in the secret life of his country he acquired inevitably by agreement with his epoch, a family illness with which he himself realized. Now it seemed he only needed a day, only an hour's run of luck in the game of history, one moment of passionate union between chance and destiny in order to soar. A revolution was expected in 1863, and in the cabinet of the future constitutional government he was listed as a prime minister. How he nursed that precious ardor within him, that mysterious something which Steklov talks about in spite of his Marxism, and which was extinguished in Siberia, although learning and logic and even implacability remained, undoubtedly existed in Chernyshevsky and manifested itself with unusual strength just before his banishment to Siberia. Magnetic and dangerous, it was this that frightened the government far more than any proclamations. This demented gang is thirsting for blood, for outrages, excitedly said the reports. Deliver us from Chernyshevsky. Desolation, lone mountain ranges, a myriad lakes and marshes, a shortage of the most essential things, inefficient postmasters, all this exhausts even the patience of genius. This is what he had copied into the Contemporary from the geographer Selsky's book on the Yakutsk province, thinking of certain things, supposing certain things, perhaps having a presentiment. In Russia, the censorship department arose before literature. Its fateful seniority had always in evidence. What an urge to give it a tweak. Chernyshevsky's activities on the Contemporary turned into a voluptuous mockery of censorship, which unquestionably was one of our country's most remarkable institutions, and right then, at a time when the authorities were fearful, for example, lest musical notes should conceal anti-governmental writings in code, and so commissioned well-paid experts to decode them. Chernyshevsky and his magazine, under the cover of elaborate clowning, was frenziedly promulgating Feuerbach. Meanwhile, whenever in articles about Garibaldi or Cavour, one shrinks from computing the miles of small print, this indefatigable man translated from the Times in his commentaries on the Italian events, he kept adding in brackets with drilling insistence after practically every other sentence, Italy. In Italy. I'm talking about Italy. The already corrupted reader knew what it meant. He was talking about Russia and the peasant question, or else Chernyshevsky would pretend he was chattering about anything that came to mind just for the sake of an incoherent and vacant prattle. but suddenly striped and spotted with words dressed in verbal camouflage, the important idea he wished to convey would slip through. Subsequently, the whole gamut of this buffoonery was carefully put together by Vladislav Kostomarov for the information of the secret police. The work is mean, but it gave essentially a true picture of Chernyshevsky's special devices. Another Kostomarov, a professor, says somewhere that Chernyshevsky was a first-rate chess player. Actually, neither Kostomarov nor Chernyshevsky knew much about chess. In his youth, it is true, Nikolai Gavrilovich once brought a set, attempted to even master a handbook and managed more or less to learn the moves and messed about with it for a time. Noting this messing about in detail, finally tiring of his empty pastime, he turned over everything to a friend. 15 years later, remembering that Lessing had got to know Mendelssohn over a chessboard, he founded the St. Petersburg Chess Club, which was opened in January 1862, consisted through spring, gradually declining, and would have failed of itself had it not been closed down in connection with the St. Petersburg fires. It was simply a literary and political circle situated in the so-called Ruadaj house. Chernyshevsky would come and sit at a table, tapping upon it with a rook, which he called a castle, and relate innocuous anecdotes. The radical Cerno Salevich would arrive, this is a Turgenevian dash, and struck up a conversation with someone in a secluded corner. It was fairly empty. The drinking fraternity, the minor writers of Pomyalovsky, Kurochkin, Krall, would vociferate in the bar. The first, by the way, did a little preaching of his own, promoting the idea of communal literary work. Let's organize, he said, a society of writer laborers for the investigating various aspects of our social life, such as beggars, haberdashers, lamplighters, firemen, and a pull of a special magazine, all the material we get. Chernyshevsky derided him with a silly rumor that went around the effect that Pomyalovsky had bashed his mug in. It's all lies. I respect you too much for that, wrote Pomyalovsky to him. In a large auditorium situated in that same Ruadaj house that took place on March 2, 1862, Chernyshevsky's first, if you do not count his dissertation defense in the graveside speech in the frost, public address. Officially, the proceeds of the evening were to go to the needy students, but in the actual fact that it was in aid of political prisoners, Mikhailov and Oberchev, who had recently been arrested. Rubinstein brilliantly performed an extremely stirring march. Professor Pavlov spoke of Russia's millennium, and added ambiguously that if the government stopped at the first step, the emancipation of the peasants, it would stop on the brink of an abyss. Let those with ears hear. They heard him. He was immediately expulsed. Nekrasov read some poor but powerful verses dedicated to the memory of Dobrolyubov, and Kurochkin read a translation of Beranger's The Little Bird, the captive's language mission, and the rapture of sudden freedom. Chernyshevsky's speech was also on Dobrolyubov. Greeted with massive applause, the youth of those days had a way of keeping their palms hollowed while they clapped, so that the result resembled a cannon salvo. He stood for a while, blinking and smiling. Alas, his appearance did not please the ladies eagerly awaiting the Tribune, whose portrait was unobtainable. An uninteresting, they said, face, haircut a la Mujik, and for some reason wearing not tails but a short coat with a braid and a horrible tie, a color catastrophe. Olga Ryzhkov, a woman of the 60s, memoirs. Besides that, he came somehow unprepared. Oratory was new to him, and trying to conceal his agitation, he adopted a conversational tone which seemed too modest to his friends and too familiar to his ill-wishers. He began by talking about his briefcase, from which he took a notebook, explaining that the most remarkable part of it was the lock with the small cogwheel. Look, if you give it a turn, the briefcase is locked, and if you want to lock it even more positively, it turns a different way, and then comes off and goes in your pocket, and on the spot where it was, here on this plaque, there are carved arabesques. Very, very nice. Then in a high edifying voice he started to read an article by Dobrolyubov that everyone knew, and suddenly broke off, and as in the authorial digression in What to Do, shammily taking in the audience into his confidence, began to explain in great detail that he had not been Dobrolyubov's guide. While speaking, he played carelessly with his watch chain, something that stuck to the minds of all memoirists, and to provide a theme for scoffing journalists. But when you come to think of it, he might have been fiddling with his watch because there is indeed very little free time left to him, 4 months in all. His tone of voice, negligee with spirit, as they used to say in the seminary, and the complete absence of revolutionary insinuations annoyed his audience. He had no success whatsoever, while Pavlov was almost cheered. The memoirist Nikolai's remarks that as soon as Pavlov had been banished from St. Petersburg, people understood and appreciated Chernyshevsky's caution. He himself, subsequently in a Siberian wilderness, where a live and avid auditorium appeared to him sometimes only in febrile dreams, keenly regretted that lame speech, that fiasco, repining at himself for not having seized that unique opportunity since he was in any case doomed to ruin, and not delivering from that lectern in the Rhodes Hall a speech of iron and fire, that very speech the hero of his novel was about to give, very likely, when upon returning to freedom he took a droshky and cried to the driver, "The galleries!" Events went very fast at Windy Spring. Fires broke out here and there, and suddenly against the orange and black background a vision, running and holding on to his hat, Dostoevsky sweeps by. Where to? Whit Monday, May 28, 1862, a strong wind is blowing, a conflagration has begun on the Lugovka, and then the desperadoes set fire to the Apraxin market. Dostoevsky is running, firemen and galloping, and in pharmacy windows and gaudy glass globes upside down are in passing reflected as seen by Nekrasov, and over there thick smoke billows over the Fontanka Canal in the direction of Shirshov Street, where presently a new black column arises. Meanwhile, Dostoevsky has arrived. He has arrived at the heart of the blackness, at Shereshevsky's place, and starts to beg him hysterically to put a stop to all this. Two aspects are interesting here: the belief in Nikolai Gavrilovich's satanic powers, and the rumors that the arson was being carried out according to the same plan which the Petroshevskins had drawn up as early as 1849. Secret agents and tones, also not void of mystic horror, reported that during the night, at the height of the disaster, laughter was heard from Chernyshevsky's window. The police endowed him with a devilish resourcefulness and smelled a trick in his every move. Nikolai Gavrilovich's family went to spend the summer at Pavlovsk, a few miles from St. Petersburg, and there a few days after the fires, on June 10th, to be precise. Dusk, mosquitoes, music, a certain Leobetsky, adjutant major of the Ulan regiment of the Guards, a dashing fellow with a name like a kiss, noticed as he was leaving the Vauxhall two ladies capering about like mad things, and in the simpleness of his heart, taking them for young camellias, loose women, he made an attempt to grasp them both by the waist. The 4 students who were with them surrounded him and threatened him with retribution, announcing that one of the ladies was the wife of the writer Shereshevsky and the other her sister. What, in the opinion of the police, is the husband's design? He tries to get the case and is submitted to the court of the Officers' Association, not out of the considerations of honor, but merely for the clandestine purpose of bringing military men and university students together. On July 5th, he had to visit the secret police department in connection with his complaint. Potapov, its chief, refused his petition, saying that according to his information, the Ulan was prepared to apologize. Shereshevsky curtly renounced any claims, and changing the subject, asked, "Tell me, the other day I sent my family off to Saratov, and I am preparing myself to go there for a rest." The Contemporary had already been closed. "But if I should need to take my wife abroad, to a spa, you see she suffers from nervous pains, could I leave without hindrance?" "Of course you could," replied Potapov good-naturedly, and 2 days later the arrest took place. All this was preceded by the following event. A universal exhibition had just opened in London. The 19th century was usually fond of exhibiting its wealth. A plentiful and tasteless dowry, which was the present one has squandered. Gathered there were tourists and merchants, correspondents and spies, and one day at an enormous banquet Herzen, in a fit of carelessness, in view of everyone, handed a certain Vatoshnikov, who is preparing to leave for Russia, a letter to the radical journalist Cerno Solovovich, which was asked to direct Shereshevsky's attention to the announcement made in the Bell concerning its willingness to publish the Contemporary abroad. The nimble foot of the messenger had hardly time to touch Russia's lands when he was seized. Shereshevsky was then living near the church of St. Vladimir. Later, his Astrakhan addresses were also defined by their proximity to this or that holy building, and a house where, before him, had lived Morilovov, later a cabinet minister, whom he was to depict with such helpless loathing in the prologue. On July 7th, 2 friends had come to see him, Dr. Nabokov, who had subsequently used to send medical advice to the exile, and Antonovich, a member of the Land and Freedom, who, in spite of his close friendship with Chernyshevsky, did not suspect that the latter was connected with the society. They were sitting in the drawing-room, where they were presently joined by Colonel Rakiv, a thick-set, black-uniformed police officer with an unpleasant, wolfish profile. He sat down with the air of a guest, and actually, he had come to arrest Shereshevsky. Again, historical patterns come into that odd contact with thrills and gamester, and as a historian, Stranyubsky, this was the same Rakiv who was an embodiment of the government's contemptible scurry, had whisked Pushkin's coffin out of the capital into posthumous exile. Having chatted a few minutes for the sake of decorum, Rakiv informed Chernyshevsky with a polite smile which caused Dr. Nabokov to turn chill inside, that he would like to have a word with him alone. "Then let's go to my study," replied the latter, and headed for it so precipitately that Rakib, though not exactly disconcerted, he was too experienced for that, did not consider it possible in his role of guest to follow him with equal speed. But Shereshevsky immediately returned, his Adam's apple convulsively bobbing as he washed something down with cold tea, swallowed papers according to Antonovitch's sinister guess, and looking over his spectacles he let his guest enter first. His friends, having nothing better to do, waiting in the drawing-room, where most of the furniture was shrouded in dust covers, seemed uncommonly bleak. "Went out for a stroll. It can't be. I can't believe it," Bokov kept repeating. And when they returned to the house, the fourth in Bolshoi Mokovsky Street, they were alarmed to see that there now stood in the door, in a kind of meek and thus all the more loathsome expectation, a prison carriage. First Bokov went in to say goodbye to Shereshevsky, then Antonovitch. Nikolai Gavrilovitch was sitting at his desk playing with a pair of scissors, while the colonel sat next to it, one leg folded over the other. They were chatting, still for the sake of decorum, about the advantages of Pavlovsk over the holiday areas, and then the company there is so excellent, the colonel was saying with a slight cough. "What, you two are going without waiting for me?" said Shereshevsky, turning to his apostle. "Unfortunately, I have to," replied Antonovitch in deep confusion. "Well, goodbye then," said Nikolai Gavrilovitch in a joking tone of voice, and lifting his hand high, he lowered it with a swoop into Antonovitch, a type of comradely farewell which is subsequently to become very widespread among Russian revolutionaries. "And so," exclaimed Stranyalubsky at the beginning of the greatest chapter in this incomparable monograph, "Shereshevsky has been seized. That night the news of the arrest flies around the whole city. Many a breast is swelled with a resonant indignation, many a hand is clenched. But there were not a few gloating sneers. Aha, they put the ruffian away, removed the impudent yowling yokel," as it was expressed by the slightly cackled anyway lady novelist Kolkonevsky. Next, Stranyalubsky gives a striking description of the complex works which the authorities had to carry out in order to create the evidence which should have been there but that was not. For a very curious situation had arisen. Judicially speaking, there was nothing to fasten onto, and they had to build a scaffolding for the law to climb up and work, so they worked with the dummy quantities, calculating to remove carefully all the dummies only when the emptiness enclosed by the law was filled up by something actual. The case built up against Shereshevsky with a phantom, but it was a phantom of genuine guilt, and then, from outside, artificially, by a roundabout route, they managed to find a certain solution to the problem which almost coincided with the true one. We have 3 points. CKPA. A cathetus is drawn CK. To offset Shereshevsky, the authorities picked out a retired Ulan cornet, Vladislav Dmitrievich Kostomarov, who, the previous August in Moscow, had been reduced to the ranks for printing seditious publications, a man with a touch of madness and a pinch of Picoranism about him, and also a verse-maker. He left a scolopendrine trace in literature and the translator of foreign poets. Another cathetus is drawn, KP. The critic Pisarev in the periodical The Russian Word writes about these translations, scolding the author for the magnificent tiaras, coruscation like a pharaoh's from Hugo, praising his simple and heartfelt rendering of some lines from Burns, which came out as, and first of all, let all men honest be. Let's pray that man be to each man a brother first of all, etc. And in connection with Kostomarov's report to his readers that Hain died an unrepentant sinner, the critic roguishly advises his grim denouncer to take a good look at his own public activities. Kostomarov's derangement was evidenced as explored graphomania, and the senseless, somnambulistic, even though made to order, composition of counterfeit letters, studded with French phrases, and finally in his macabre playfulness he signed his reports to Putulin, a detective, Theophan Ochaneshchenko, Theophanes, our father's son, or Ventislav Luty, Wenceslaus the Fiend, and indeed he was fiendish in his taciturnity, funest and false, boastful and cringing. Endowed with curious abilities, he could write with a feminine hand, explaining this himself by the fact that he was visited at the full moon by the spirit of Queen Tamara. The plurality of hands he could imitate, in addition to the circumstance, yet one more of Destiny's jokes, that his normal handwriting recalled that of Shereshevsky, considerably heightened the value of his hypnotic betrayer. For indirect evidence that the appeal proclamation to the serfs of landowners had been written by Shereshevsky, Kostomarov was given, first, the task of fabricating a note allegedly from Chernyshevsky, containing a request to alter one word in the appeal, and secondly, of preparing a letter to Alexei Nikolaevich that would furnish proof of Chernyshevsky's active participation in the revolutionary movement. Both one and the other were then and there concocted by Kostomarov. The forgery of the handwriting is quite evident. At the beginning of the forger still took pains, but then seems to have grown bored by the work, and to be in a hurry to get it over, to make the word I, ya, formed in Russian script somewhat like a professor's daily. And Chernyshevsky's genuine manuscripts, it ends in an outgoing stroke, which is straight and strong, and even curves a little to the right. While here, in the forgery, this stroke curves with a kind of queer jauntiness to the left, toward the head, as if Ya were saluting. While these preparations went on, Nikolai Gavrilovich was held in the Alexiev Ravlin for the Peter and Paul fortress, in close proximity of the 22-year-old Pisarev, who had been imprisoned for 4 days before him. The hypnotus was drawn. CP and the fateful triangle CPKs consolidated. At first, life in prison does not oppress Chernyshevsky. The absence of importunate visitors even seemed refreshing. But the hush of the unknown soon began to chafe him. A deep matting swallowed without a trace the steps of the sentries pacing along the corridors. The only sound that came from the outside was the clock's classic striking, which vibrated long in one's ears. It was the life whose betrayal demands in a writer an abundance of dots. It was that unkind Russian isolation from which sprang the Russian dream of a kind of multitude. By lifting a corner of the green blaze curtain, the sentry could look through the peephole in the door, and the prisoner sitting on his green wooden bed, or the green chair, wearing a dressing gown of frieze and peaked cap. One was permitted to keep one's own headgear as long as it was not a top hat, which does credit to the government's sense of harmony, but creates, by the law of negatives, a rather tenacious image. As for Pisarev, he sported a fez. He was allowed a goose quill pen, and one could write on a small green table with a sliding drawer, whose bottom, like Achilles' heel, had remained unpainted. Stranyalubsky. Autumn passed. A small rowan tree grew in the prison yard. Prisoner number 9 was not fond of walking. At the beginning, however, he was out every day reasoning, a quirk of thought extremely characteristic for him. Yet during this time the cell was searched. Consequently, a refusal to go out for a walk could cause the administration to suspect that he was hiding something there. But when he had to become convinced that this was not so, by leaving threads here and there as marks, he sat down to write with a light heart. By winter he had finished his translation to Schlosser, and had begun to translate Gervinus and T.B. Macaulay. He also wrote 1 or 2 things of his own. Let us recall the diary, and from one of our much earlier paragraphs, let us pick up the loose ends of the same sentences dealing in advance with his writings in the fortress, or not. Let us go, if you please, even further back to the Lacry lamentatory theme, which began to rotate on the initial pages of our mysteriously revolving story. Before us is Chernyshevsky's famous letter to his wife, dated December 5th, 1862, a yellow diamond among the dust of his numerous works. We examined this harsh-looking and ugly but amazingly legible handwriting, with its resolute strokes in the tails of the words, with loopy R's and P's and the broad, fervent crosses of the hard signs, and our lungs dilate with a pure emotion, such as we have not experienced for a long time. Stranyalubsky justly designates this letter as the beginning of Chernyshevsky's brief flowering. All the fire, all the power of will and the mind allotted to him, everything that was supposed to burst forth at the hour of national uprising, that burst forth and clutch in its hold, even if only for a short time, that supreme power, to jerk violently the bridle and perhaps the crimson lip of Russia, the rearing steed, the blood, all this now found a stick outlet in his correspondence. One can say, in fact, that here is the aim and crown of all life's dialectic, which had long been accumulating in muffled depths, these iron fury-driven epistles to the commission examining his case, which he included in letters to his wife, the exultant rage of his arguments, and this chain-rattling megalomania. Men will remember us with gratitude, he wrote to Olga Sakratevna, and he turned out to be right. It was precisely this sound which echoed and spread through all the remaining space of the century, making the hearts of millions of intellectual provincials beat with sincere and noble tenderness. We have already referred to that part of the letter where he talks of his plans for compiling dictionaries. After the words, as was Aristotle, came to the words, I have begun speaking, however, my thoughts. They are a secret. You must not tell anyone about what I am to say to you alone. Here, comments Steklov. On these 2 lines, a teardrop has fallen. The Chernyshevsky had to repeat the blurred letters. This is not quite right. The teardrop fell near the fold of the sheet before the writing of these 2 lines. Chernyshevsky had to rewrite 2 words secret and about. one at the beginning of the first line and the other at the beginning of the second, words which he had started to trace each time in the wet place and which remained therefore unfinished. 2 days afterwards, getting more and more angry and more believing in his invulnerability, he began to maul his judges. The second letter to his wife can be divided up into 2 points. 1. I told you in connection with the rumors about my possible arrest that I was not mixed up in any affair and that the government would be forced to apologize if it arrested me. 2. I assumed this because I knew they were following me. They boasted that they were doing it very well, and I relied on their boast, for my calculation was that knowing how I lived and what I did, they would know that their suspicions were groundless. 3. It was a stupid calculation, for I also knew that in our country people are incapable of doing anything properly. 4. Thus by my arrest they have compromised the government. 5. What can we do? Apologize? But what if he doesn't accept an apology and says, you have compromised the government. It is my duty to explain this to the government. 6. Therefore, we shall postpone the unpleasantness. 7. By the government asks from time to time whether Shereshevsky is guilty, and finally the government will obtain an answer. 8. It is that answer I am waiting for. The copy of a rather curious letter from Shereshevsky added Potapov in pencil, but he is mistaken. No one will have to apologize. A few days later after that, he began to write his novel, What to Do, and by January 15th, he had sent the first portion to Pippin. A week later, he sent a second, and Pippin handed both to Nekrasov for the Contemporary, which had again been permitted beginning with February. At the same time, the Russian Word was also allowed after a similar 8-month suspension, and in the impatient expectation of journalistic profit, the dangerous Fez neighbor had already dipped his pen. It is gratifying to be able to state that, at this juncture, some mysterious force resolved to try and save Shereshevsky at least from this mess. He was having a particularly hard time. How could one fail to have compassion? On the 28th, because the government, exasperated by his attacks, had refused him permission to see his wife, he began a hunger strike. Hunger strikes were then a novelty in Russia, and the exponent they found was clumsy. The guards noticed that he was wasting, but the food seemed to be getting eaten. When, however, 4 days later, struck by the putrid smell in the cell, the warders searched it. They established that the solid food had been hidden among the books, while the cabbage soup had been poured into the cracks. On Sunday, February 3, at about 1 p.m., the military doctor attached to the fortress examined the prisoner and found that he was pale, his tongue fairly clear, his pulse a little weak, and on the same day, at that same hour, Nekrasov, on his way home, corner of Lyetnyana and Besnya streets, in a hackney sleigh, lost the pink paper package containing 2 manuscripts, each threaded through with the corners and entitled What to Do, while remembering with the lucidity of despair the whole of his route. He did not recall the fact that when nearing his house, he had laid the package beside him in order to take out his purse, and just then the sleigh had turned, a crunch as it skidded, and What to Do rolled off unnoticed. This was the attempt of the mysterious force, in this case centrifugal, to confiscate the book whose success was destined to have such a disastrous effect on the fate of its author. But the attempt failed. On the snow near the Mariinsky Hospital, the pink package was picked up by a poor clerk burdened with a large family. Having plodded home, he donned his spectacles and examined his mind. He saw that it was the beginning of some kind of literary work, and without a tremor and not burning his sluggish fingers, he put it aside. Destroy it, begged a hopeless voice. In vain. A notice of its loss was printed in the St. Petersburg Police Gazette. The clerk carried the package to the indicated address, for which he received the promised reward, 50 silver rubles. In the meantime, his jailers had begun to give Nikolai Gavrilovitch appetite-stimulating drops. Twice he took them, and then, suffering greatly, he announced that he would take no more, for he was refusing to eat not from absence of appetite, but from caprice. On the morning of 6th, owing to lack of experience in discerning the symptoms of suffering, he ended his hunger strike and had breakfast. On 12th, Potapov informed the commandant that the commission could not permit Shereshevsky to see his wife until he had completely recovered. The following day, the commandant reported that Shereshevsky was well and riding at full breast. Olga Sokratovna came with loud complaints about her health, about the Pipins, about the shortage of money, and then through her tears began to laugh at the little beard her husband had grown, finally getting even more upset and commencing to embrace him. That will do, my dear, that will do, he kept saying quite calmly, using the tepid tone he invariably maintained in his relations with her. Actually, he loved her passionately, hopelessly. Neither I nor anyone else can have any grounds for thinking I shall not be set free, he told her in parting, with particular emphasis. Another month passed. On March 23rd, there was a confrontation with Kostomarov. Vladislav Dmitrievich Glowered and obviously got tangled up in his own lies, Chernyshevsky, with a slight smile of disgust, replied abruptly and contemptuously. His superiority was striking. And to think, exclaims Steklov, that at this time he was writing the buoyant What to Do. Alas, to write What to Do in the fortress was not so much surprising as reckless, even for the very reason that the authorities attached it to his case. In general, the history of this novel's appearance is extremely interesting. The censorship permitted it to be published in the Contemporary, reckoning on the fact that a novel which was something in the highest degree of anti-artistic would be certain to overthrow Chernyshevsky's authority, that he would simply be laughed at for it. And indeed, what worth, for example, are the light scenes in the novel? Verozhka was supposed to drink half a glass for her wedding, half a glass for her shop, and half a glass for the health of Julie, a redeemed Parisian prostitute who is now the girlfriend of one of the characters. She and Julie started a romp. With screams and clamor, they began to wrestle and both fell on the sofa. They no longer wanted to get up, but only continued screaming and laughing, and both fell asleep. Sometimes the turn of phrase smacks of folksy barrack lore, and sometimes of Zoshenko. After tea, she went to her room and lay down. So there she is, reading in her comfy bed, but the book sinks away from her eyes, and now Vera Pavlovna is thinking, what is it that somehow I feel lately somewhat dull sometimes? There are also so many charming solecisms. Here is a specimen. When one of the characters, a doctor, has pneumonia and calls it a colleague, for a long time they palpated the sides of one of them. But nobody laughed. Not even the great Russian writers laughed. Even Herzen found it vilely written, immediately qualified this with, on the other hand, there is much that is good and healthy. Still, he could not resist remarking that the novel ends not simply with a philanthropy, but with a phalanstery and a brothel. For, of course, the inevitable happened. The eminently pure Chernyshevsky, who had never been to a brothel, and his artless aspiration to equip communal love with the especially beautiful trappings, involuntarily and unconsciously out of the simplicity of his imagination, had worked his way through to those very ideals that had been evolved by tradition and routine in houses of ill repute. His gay evening ball, based on freedom and equality in relations between the sexes, first one, and then the other couple disappears and returns again, is extremely reminiscent of the concluding dances in Madame Tellier's establishment. And nevertheless, it is impossible to handle this old magazine, March 1863, containing the first installment of the novel, without a certain thrill. Here also is Nekrasov's poem, Green Noise, Endure While You Still Can Endure, and the derisive dressing down of Alexei Tolstoy's romance, Prince Sarabayny, and instead its expected sneers, an atmosphere of general, pious worship was created around What to Do. It was read the way liturgical books are read. Not a single work of Turgenev or Tolstoy produced such a mighty impression. The inspired Russian reader understood the good that the talentless novelist had vainly tried to express. It would seem that, having realized its miscalculation, the government should have interrupted the serialization of What to Do. It behaved much more cleverly. Chernyshevsky's neighbor had now also done some writing. He had been receiving the Contemporary, and on October 8th, he sent the Russian Word an article from the Fortress, Thoughts about Russian Novels, at which the Senate informed the Governor-General that this was nothing else but an analysis of Chernyshevsky's novel, with praise for the work and a detailed exposition of the materialistic ideas in it. In order to characterize Pisarev, it was indicated that he was subject to dementia and melancholia, for which he had been treated. In 1859, he spent 4 months in a lunatic asylum. Just as in his boyhood he had arrayed all his notebooks in rainbow covers, so as a grown man, Pisarev would suddenly abandon some urgent work in order to painstakingly color woodcuts in books, or when going off to the country would order red and blue summer suits of seraphine calico for his tailor. The professed utilitarian's mental illness was distinguished by a kind of perverted aestheticism. Once, as a student gathering, he suddenly stood up, gracefully raised his curved arm as if requesting permission to speak, and in the sculpturesque pose fell down unconscious. Another time, to the alarm of his hostess and fellow guests, he began to undress, throwing off all gay alacrity his velvet jacket, motley vest, checkered trousers. At this point they overpowered him. Amusingly enough, there are commentators who call Pisarev an epicure, referring, for example, to his letters to his mother. Unbearable bilious teeth-clenching phrases about life being beautiful, or else to illustrate his sober realism, they quote his outwardly sensible and clear, but actually completely insane letter from the fortress to an unknown maiden with a proposal of marriage. The woman who agrees to lighten and warm my life will receive from me all the love which was spurned by Reza, which she threw herself at the neck of the handsome eagle, now condemned to a 4-year imprisonment for his small part in the general disturbances of the time, which were based in a way in the blind belief in the printed word, especially the secretly printed word. Pisarev wrote about what to do, reviewing it bit by bit for the Russian word, as the installments appeared in the Contemporary, although in the beginning of the Senate was puzzled by the novel's being praised for its ideas instead of being ridiculed because of its style. It expressed the fear that the praises might have a deleterious effect on the younger generation. The authorities soon realized how important it was in the present case to obtain by this method a complete picture of Shereshevsky's perniciousness, which Kostomarov had only outlined in the list of his special devices. The government, says Stranyalubsky, on the one hand permitting Shereshevsky to produce a novel in the fortress, and on the other permitting Pisarev, his fellow captive, to produce articles explaining the intentions of the novel, acted with complete awareness, waiting curiously for Shereshevsky to babble himself out and watching what would come of it, in connection with the abundant discharges of his incubator neighbor. The business went smoothly and promised a great deal, but it was necessary to put pressure on Kostomarov since 1 or 2 definite proofs of guilt were needed, while Shereshevsky continued to boil and jeer in great detail, branding the commission as clowns and an incoherent quagmire which is completely stupid. Therefore Kostomarov was taken to Moscow, and there was a citizen Yakovlev, his former copyist, a drunkard and a rowdy, gave important testimony for his received an overcoat which he drank away so noisily in Tver that he was put in a straitjacket while doing his copying on account of the summer weather at a garden pavilion. He allegedly heard Nikolai Gavrilovich and Vladislav Dmitrievich, as they were strolling arm in arm in a not implausible detail, talking about greetings from well-wishers to the serfs. It is difficult to find one's way in this mixture of truth and promptings. At a second interrogation of the presence of replenished Kostomarov, Shereshevsky said somewhat unfortunately that he had visited him only once and had not found in him. Then he added forcefully, I'll die, but I will not change my testimony. The testimony of his not being the author of the proclamation is written by him in a trembling hand, trembling with rage rather than fright. However that may have been, the case was coming to an end. There followed the Senate's definition. Very nobly it found Shereshevsky's unlawful dealings with Herzen unproved, for Herzen's definition of the Senate, see below, at the end of this paragraph. As for the appeal to the serfs of landowners, here the fruit had already ripened to the espaliers of forgery and bribes. The absolute moral conviction of the senators that Shereshevsky was the author thereof was transformed into judicial proof by the letter to Alexei Naklevich, meaning apparently A.N. Pleshchev, a peaceful poet dubbed by Dostoevsky an all-round blonde, but for some reason no one insisted too much on Pleshchev's part, if any, in the matter. Thus in Shereshevsky's person they condemned a phantasm closely resembling him, and invented guilt was wonderfully rigged up to look like a real one. The sentence was comparatively light compared with what one is generally able to devise in this line. He was to be exiled for 14 years of penal servitude, and then to go live in Siberia forever. The definition went from the savage ignoramuses of the state to the grave villains of the state council, who completely subscribed to it, and then went on to the sovereign, who confirmed it but reduced the term of penal servitude by half. On May 4, 1864, the sentence was announced to Shereshevsky, and on the 19th at 8 o'clock in the morning on Mitsky Square he was executed.